Good morning. It is time for a chapter 1. So Hope and Glory. The Trouble with Hope and Glory. Here it is on my Nook. Released yesterday. And this book is one of a series of novellas that takes place in Tumbleweed, Texas. And the novellas, they're all written by different authors. So what we did, and this is myself and Christy Craig and Diane Kelly and Lawrence Kelter, we created the town of Tumbleweed, Texas, and completely fictional, but we have some shared characteristics. So for example, there's Cowboy Coffee, which is the one and only coffee shop on the square. There's no Starbucks in Tumbleweed, Texas. And there's Norm the barista, who is straight out of Tony Soprano's gang in New Jersey, and he's definitely a fish out of water. And then there's McKenna, the perennial perky millennial. And she owns Cowboy Coffee. And let's see what else. We have shared characters like Roscoe, Star, and Tookie, who owns Tookie's Diner. We have these shared characters, these shared locations, but then we each created our own stories and our own characters with mysteries that take place in Tumbleweed. And all the stories start with the trouble with, and so mine is the trouble with Hope and Glory. And I thought I would read to you chapter 1. So Hope McIntyre is a journalist, and we're pretending that journalism is still a really viable career in life. And she works for Tumbleweed Today, which is an online newspaper magazine in the town. I'm pulling it up on my Nook. Hang on a second. So she writes these articles for Tumbleweed Today, and the first article is how the book starts, and it's what she's choosing to write about, which is the upcoming Mrs. Tumbleweed pageant in Tumbleweed, Texas. So here we go. Tumbleweed Today, the blight of the beauty pageant by Hope McIntyre. What is beauty? Well, it depends on the era. Within the land of beauty pageants, beauty is a reflection of society at the time. In the 1950s, beauty queens had Marilyn Monroe bodies, hourglass curves with wide hips and voluptuous breasts. Go back to the 1920s and you see a completely different standard. The beauty queens from that era reflected the independence women were just starting to take. Short hair and skinny bodies without much shape were held up as the standard. We still see this, impossible standards for girls to live up to in magazines today. Is it any wonder we have a society of girls with body dysmorphia, eating disorders, and self-harm? Is anyone surprised that social media has opened a floodgate of anonymous body shaming? It happens to Hollywood's biggest stars: Jennifer Aniston, Serena Williams, Drew Barrymore, Lady Gaga, Selena Gomez. Seriously, people, let's abolish pageant culture here in Texas. Let's move away from celebrating women's beauty and flagellating them for their flaws, and let's take a look at the more important parts of them, their talents, their brains, thoughts, and feelings, because beauty fades. Okay, so that's how the story opens, with that little article that Hope writes. And now here we go with chapter 1. I'm going to move my Nook over here so I can see better. Jeremy Standard gaped at me, his hand crumpling the page he held in his sweaty palm. My article. Jeremy was a bald, bug-eyed cretin in Wrangler jeans and a button-down shirt with a coffee stain, as if he'd missed his mouth and dribbled, and cowboy boots sporting a thin coating of mud. If the guy owned a washing machine or a shoe cleaner, he didn't use either. He waved the sheet of paper, red marks slashing through words and lines. Geez, Hope, you know we can't print this. We live in Texas, for fuck's sake. Texas, the land of big hair and beauty pageants. Make that a bald, bug-eyed, idiotic cretin in Wrangler jeans, a stained button-down, and dirty boots. Or was that redundant? I didn't care. He was idiotic and a cretin, so if the boot fit. I didn't care that we were on full display in the middle of Cowboy Coffee, Tumbleweed's one and only coffee shop, and therefore every Tumbleweeder's social hotspot. I shifted my weight onto one hip and folded my arms over my chest like armor. Defiance, meet hope. Just because beauty pageants have been a thing doesn't mean they have to stay a thing, I said. Except I'm not going to let an article for the Tumbleweed Today site put a black mark on Texas pageants, he said. We have to start somewhere, I argued, because if nobody ever did anything, nobody and nothing would change. We have to change ourselves. Be the change, yada, 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 Jeremy said, interrupting her. He gathered up the printed pages of spreadsheets he'd been highlighting, tapping the edges on the table to straighten them out. Gandhi didn't live in 21st century Texas. My eyelids fluttered closed for a moment, long enough for me to inhale, then slowly exhale. I forced myself to remain calm. The din of the coffee shop rang in my ears. Norman's surly voice behind the counter came at me like slow bullets to the brain. The town was so small that Jeremy's office was a table at Cowboy Coffee. How ridiculous was that? Very, I thought. Very fucking ridiculous. I had to remind myself that I chose to stay in Tumbleweed. I could have gone to Dallas or Fort Worth or even to Austin. Why hadn't I gone to Austin? But no, I'd been born here. I'd gotten my degree at the College of West Texas in Tumbleweed, and I'd stayed. I glared at Jeremy. That's not what Gandhi said. He raised his sleepy gaze to me. What? Gandhi. He didn't say be the change. He said we mirror the world. All our tendencies present in the outer world are to be found in the world of our body. If we could change ourselves, the tendencies in the world would also change. Oh my God. Jeremy scrubbed his face with one hand. I really don't care what Gandhi said. What is your point? Steady breath, slow and calm. My point, I said, is that we have to change ourselves in order to change the world, and we can start by getting rid of pageants. Jeremy let loose an exasperated sigh as if he hadn't already made it perfectly clear just how irritated he was. Except we're not going to do away with pageants in the world, in Texas, or in Tumbleweed. Got it? They're here to stay. The series of Tumbleweed pageants brings a lot of revenue to this town. Do you want to see that dry up? Do you want to see Tookie and her cronies go out of business? No more slap your mama or kill me now pie? Or TNT, he said, referring to Turton Teeth Optional, the dimly lit bar on the southeast side of the square, because people in this town need a place to let their hair down. Or this place. You really want to put McKenna out of business? He flung his arm out, gesturing toward the counter, and dropped his voice. I mean, come on. Who the hell else is going to hire a guy like Norman? I looked at Norman. The other barista, Susie, was a pale waif who'd been a few years behind me in school. From the way she looked, like a spooked deer in the headlights, it was as if she had heard what Jeremy had said. While I had no doubt that McKenna would land on her feet if something with her coffee shop went south. After all, she was one of those perennially perky millennials whose superpower was positivity. I wasn't so sure about her employees. I was pretty sure McKenna kept Norman around because she felt sorry for the guy, although I also thought the sympathy was totally misguided. Norman No-Neck Smith danced to the beat of his own drum and stuck out like a sore thumb. He was the only person in town who wore sharkskin boots and $500 suits. I knew this because I'd seen the label once and had looked it up. He drove a pristine Cadillac and dropped F-bombs more frequently than Tony Soprano. At the moment, Norman stood nose-to-nose with Kyle Boomer Baldwin. Boomer was so named because of his longtime affinity for explosives. He'd started in middle school by blowing up the garbage cans behind the school. From there, his efforts only got bigger. Needless to say, Boomer didn't graduate high school. His juvenile record was sealed, but a short stint at a West Texas detention center meant the military didn't want him. Our local watering hole didn't actually need a bouncer, but Buck Spur liked giving himself badass air, so he kept Boomer front and center. I couldn't fault Buck for his efforts. I was always trying to lift myself above my current life status, so I completely understood. Norman and Boomer were like two Neanderthals facing off, one a youngster in the tribe, the other an elder. I heard a grunt, but I couldn't tell which one it had come from. They were both the strong, grunting type. Norman handed over two to-go cups. Susie took a step back as Boomer grunted again, turned his glare to her, then lumbered out. Jeremy was still talking to me. You forget, he said, that I see you in here every morning getting your daily fix. Without the pageant attendees, how are these businesses supposed to survive? I wanted to clench my fists and stomp my foot. I was here every day because he was here every day. This was his office, but damn it, he was right. The stupid pageants, Miss Star of Tumbleweed, Miss Tumbleweed Teen, Miss Texas Teen, Ms. Tumbleweed, and Mrs. Tumbleweed, which led to the bigger Mrs. Texas America pageant, were not going anywhere. It was absolutely foolish of me to think that one little article in a local magazine could change the culture of this town, or the state for that matter. So I take it you're not publishing it, I said, stating the obvious, because of course he wasn't going to publish it. Fine, I could go work on the article about the college cutting funding to its teaching program. If that's all, I have an appointment with the Dean of Education. You're going to redo it with a positive spin this time, he said, interrupting me again. I stared at him, focusing on the tiny spot on his bald scalp. I shook my head as if I could dislodge the cotton his words had shoved in there. Wait, what? You're going to redo it, he said again, more slowly this time, as if I was too thick to have understood his words the first time around. Oh, I'd understood. I just couldn't believe it. Clearly, Hope McIntyre, was not the best person to write an article lauding the greatness of Tumbleweed's beauty pageants. I have an appointment with the Dean of Education at the college, I repeated, finishing my sentence this time. Plus, I have a lead on a new story. An old friend of mine emailed. You know her, Kenzie. His eyes narrowed as much as two bulbous spheres could. What's the lead? A little burst of excitement bloomed. Maybe he'd consider putting someone else on the pageant pieces if I could present him with something better. I don't know yet. She emailed me to say she wanted to talk. Which means you have nothing. No, but I can call her back and don't. You're on the pageant pieces leading up to the competition. Benedict will do the college story, Jeremy said. Benedict? I sputtered. But he's green, and I did the legwork about the budget cuts. Jeremy held up one hand, palm out, stopping me. I make the assignments, he said, but he might as well have bellowed, the great and powerful Oz has spoken. He left no room for ifs, ands, or buts. I tried anyway. But why? Jeremy stared at me as if he couldn't believe I was still standing here challenging him. Write it as a human interest story about your sister. What? Come on, our readers will love it. Gloria's been on the pageant circuit since she learned to walk. That was true. And she's won every pageant she ever entered. Also true. And she's competing in the Mrs. Tumbleweed. Oh, God. True. So she knows everything about our local pageants. I hung my head. True. And who better to get her story than her big sister? I snapped my head up. Not true. So not true. Gloria and I don't really see eye to eye. She knows how I feel about pageants. She won't open up to me about any of it. I'm not publishing this. Jeremy abandoned his spreadsheets and made a show of crumpling my article. He aimed and tossed it through the small basketball hoop anchored to the wall above the little trash can. I don't know if Jeremy had installed that hoop himself or if McKenna had, or if it had simply always been there. I guessed the latter. It just came with the place. I glanced at the signed photographs of John Wayne, Johnny Cash, and Gene Autry hanging on the wall above Jeremy's head. Had any of them tossed their trash through that hoop? Jeremy probably thought so. I could see the flash of pleasure he got from making the basket. He leveled his bug-eyed gaze at me, his lids lowering over them. The guy had a face meant for radio. Is there anything else? He asked, his tone making it clear he didn't want to hear another peep from me. I got the message loud and clear. We'd been here before, on opposing sides of an argument. At a backyard picnic, I might win. Probably would win. I'd grown up with Jeremy. He'd lived across the street for most of my childhood. But here, in the office, I knew my place. Jeremy was my boss now. And after all the years I'd spent ignoring him, shunning his attention, turning down his invitations to school dances, to the drive-in, he was finally on top. In the office, he would never let me forget that he would always put me in my place. And that is chapter 1 of The Trouble with Hope and Glory. This series is so much fun. Think of it as an anthology. So each novella stands alone, but they're all connected through this town called Tumbleweed, Texas. So I hope that you're intrigued by Hope and everything she hates about beauty pageants. And then we've yet to meet her sister Glory, who is everything about beauty pageants. So, yeah, we'll have to see what happens. And, of course, there's a murder. That's it, guys. Grab this book, The Trouble with Hope and Glory, and I will see you next time for another Chapter 1.